The year was 1860, and the peak of the gold rush in Northern California had passed. Days were getting longer, and returns were only shrinking. As the gold in the Sierras started to dry up, miners started looking elsewhere to find their prospects of gold. Eventually, miners made their way into Southern California and into the granite-rich deserts. The deserts were a lot different than the Sierras. Water was scarce, the summers were hot, and the wood resources used to construct mines was limited. Mining in the desert was also difficult because transportation of the equipment proved to be hard and more expensive. Only a few of the most daring miners made their way into the lands known now as Joshua Tree National Park, and in their time constructed around 300 different mines. Of these 300 mines constructed in the park, very few were viable producers. One of the very few mines that were actually a good producer was the Lost Horse Mine. Between 1894 and 1931, this mine alone produced more than 10,000 ounces of gold and 16,000 ounces of silver. The value of that gold and silver today would be over $19 million. History of the Lost Horse Mine is as rich as a Western campfire tale. From gunslinging cowboys to cattle rustlers and horse thieves, the lure of gold in this particular spot proved to be one of the park's greatest stories. When miners entered the area in the year 1890, there was nothing but cattle and Indians, said one longtime resident, Johnny Lang. Johnny had moved west from New Mexico after his brother and 6 other cowboys were gunned down and forced out of the state. While camping in a local valley, Johnny Lang woke up one morning to his horses being gone. After eventually tracking them to a nearby camp, Johnny was told by a competing miner that his horses were not there and to leave the area. After talking with a different prospector in the area, Johnny was informed of a rich claim, but the man who had informed him was too afraid to develop it himself. Eventually, Johnny and his brothers bought the deed to the land and named it the Lost Horse Mine. 2 years later, Johnny Lang would eventually sell shares of the mine to a wealthy rancher from Montana named J.D. Ryan. J.D. would quickly increase production 5-fold at the site with a new steam-powered mill. The steam-powered mill could be heard from across the valley floor, echoing like thunder in an auditorium. This 24-hour operation was consistently crushing rock and washing the slurry over copper plates to isolate the gold and silver. The gold would be collected, separated, and melted into bricks. These bricks were eventually carried to Banning, a town 65 miles away, every week. The trip to Banning and back took 5 days and would also help to resupply the camp with provisions. While the amount of gold being produced was impressive, things weren't quite adding up for J.D. Ryan. As the story goes, the day shift was producing the amount of gold as big as a softball, but for some reason, the night shift was only producing the amount of a golf ball. Suspicious, J.D. Ryan hired a detective to investigate. The detective eventually uncovered that Johnny Lang was removing about half the gold produced at night. J.D. laid out the choice of either going to jail or selling out of the operations. Lang chose the latter and relocated to a different valley in the area. Lost Horse Mine eventually stopped production in the year 1905 when miners hit a fault line and ran out of the precious ore-bearing vein. The lease of the mine would hop around like a frog, falling from one person to another, and would only produce a few hundred ounces of gold between 1905 and 1931, when operations eventually ended. Lang, who lived in a valley over, would be found in the winter of 1925, dead alongside the road, found with only a gold bullion in his pocket. It was suspected that Lang would walk over to the abandoned mine and uncover gold that was previously hidden. 5 years after the mine shut down, Joshua Tree National Monument was erected in the year 1936. The Lost Horse Mine eventually fell into the hands of the National Park Service. The Park Service fiddled between keeping the mine as a historical site, but also making it a safe area for visitors. Within time, portions of the mine began to collapse and cave in. In the past 20 years, the once 500-foot mine shaft and tunnels all began to collapse. Between earthquakes and the unstable conditions at the site, the Park Service needed to act to protect visitors. Previous cable netting and concrete caps were consumed by an ever-expanding sinkhole from the mine. With new technologies and innovations, a plastic foam was injected into the site, providing a stable plug to prevent further degradation. The Park Service has since also installed a wooden replica of what the mine used to look like. While the mine alone is probably the most popular and well-visited attraction, it brings up a point of contention between closing mines off to the public, but also preserving history and concern for public safety. In 2022, Joshua Tree National Park was awarded funds as a part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. The park decided to use this money to improve visitor safety and also for ecosystem restoration. David Smith, the park superintendent, said, "The park has benefited from bipartisan infrastructure law funds by implementing measures to make areas in and around historic mines safe for public visitation." The initial project had the goal of closing 5 abandoned mines by the spring of 2023. The park has also been using the money in the most efficient ways possible, due to them having the right people and the right equipment to complete the projects. This project also worked alongside wildlife experts to avoid breeding seasons for bats that use the caves for reproduction and animals that use the caves to hibernate in the winter. The park also decided to use different techniques such as bat gapes, cupolas, and fencing in order to preserve both the safety for visitors and wildlife. While the park does realize the public interest and history in the mines, they ultimately value public safety due to the mines imposing significant risk for injury and death. The preserved site of the Lost Horse Mine is still considered to be one of the best preserved mills of its kind for the National Park Service. The Lost Horse location is still a very popular destination for visitors looking for a moderately easy hike. Although the site is relatively stable, the Park Service still warns visitors to proceed with caution as there's no guarantee for safety. Lost Horse Mine hike is rated at a moderate difficulty and is a roughly 6.5-mile loop. To avoid the harsh summer heat, it is strongly advised to attempt the hike between October and April. For information regarding the Lost Horse Mine hike, those interested can find a plethora of resources through a quick Google search of third-party websites. Some of my favorite are linked below. Those interested in more information and history about the Lost Horse Mine should also check out the National Park Service website linked in the description. Thank you, and have a good day.